Hello, everybody, and welcome to Adult Education for September 20th, 2020. This is a good day to be together, and whenever you are watching this, if you're watching this on the website, it is good for you to be here no matter what day it is. We have a great presentation today, and I'm looking forward to it. So I'm going to open us with a prayer before turning it over to Jenny von Bergen. Holy and gracious God, we give thanks. We give thanks for your eternal word, for the wisdom to discern what it may mean to us today, and for the community that helps us discern together. We give thanks for leaders and learners. We give thanks that in doing so, we are able to more completely live into the vision of the world you have for us. Amen. All right, Jenny, it's your show now.
Yes, I am excited today to introduce our presenter for our first adult education hour for the 2021 school year, and it is Michael Whitley. And Michael is the former Los Angeles Times assistant managing editor, and as his sister-in-law, I was really excited when they moved back to the Madison area about a year ago. And he is currently working at the University of Wisconsin. He will be discussing today how media influences our lives in unintended ways. He'll also be looking at the ways the Bible can teach us more about looking at more than one source and probably some other things. Michael is open to questions, and he'll kind of explain how that works in his presentation. So I will leave it to you, Michael.
All right, so thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to speak to you all. And as I'm going through the presentation, if you have a question, don't feel like you have to wait till the end. If there's a question you have about something I've said, you can certainly just jump right in and ask me. I'm so full of words, I will just keep right on talking. So don't feel afraid to go, hey, Michael, just one moment, please. So I'm going to start my screen share. There we go. And hopefully now you can all see my slide screen. So what can the Bible teach us about where we get the news is the topic I'm going to be talking about today. My name is Michael Whitley. I was the assistant managing editor of the Los Angeles Times. I have had about a 25-year career in journalism and worked at some really extraordinary publications. I grew up in the small town of Versailles, Kentucky. Spelled like Versailles, France, but pronounced Versailles. We Kentuckyized it a little bit. You can see on our sign in the front of the church I grew up in that it was established in 1813, and in that part of Kentucky, that made it the New Presbyterian Church, which it is still referred to today because there are many other churches that had been founded in the 1700s. I attended the University of Evansville in Indiana and earned my BA in journalism with a specialization in investigative reporting and photojournalism. I also have a Bachelor of Science in political science. When I was at the school newspaper, I was the editor of my college newspaper, and as editor, I led an investigative report that got our dean of students fired. And that was my first introduction really into the power of journalism as truth-telling. I also studied classics. I have a degree in archaeology. As part of my classics education, I took biblical archaeology, and I liked my professor so much I took some theology classes. One of the things I used my classics experience and degree for was in my ancient Greek class, I would always translate Bible verses. And again, it was that journalism skepticism of, was the translation I was reading correct? And I wanted to check it for myself to be sure. My career path has been a winding one. In college, I worked at the Evansville Courier and Press and at the Princeton, Indiana Daily Clarion, which is a really small town newspaper where I had to learn how to do everything, including run the press. I worked for Time Magazine and Time Life Books based in Europe. Worked for Copley Chicago newspapers, which were the suburban newspapers, the San Diego Union Tribune, the Charlotte Observer, the Los Angeles Times, and finally now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Not to humble brag myself, but at age 34, I was named assistant managing editor. I was the youngest newsroom executive at the Los Angeles Times in the 150 plus year history of the organization, and youngest by almost 18 years. I made some important contributions to the coverage of the Times. This was one example. This is a pen sketch that I made on a little memo piece of paper on my desk about a story where one of our reporters had discovered a city manager in one of the small cities in Los Angeles County had self-approved raises for himself over many years, up to $800,000 a year. And so something wasn't right about that. And we didn't know that he had done anything criminal yet. We just knew that from the documents that we had pulled, he had approved it. And it had been listed for an inside page of the paper, down page, inside page. No one was sure this was important. I was sure it was important and asked that we re-edit it and put it on the front page of the newspaper. And it turned out to be a really important decision. There were about 15 people who went to federal prison as a result of this story, and there was a finance reform in some of the smaller towns in California as a result. And then this is me over there. You can see me, I'm blurry. This is the day that they announced we had won the Pulitzer Prize for that series of stories. And so I've been lucky and fortunate to have contributed to some very important things. Earlier, I showed you that I was that little corner name, the assistant managing editor. Well, I was at the Los Angeles Times long enough that I was the last one of those people left from the day that I was named assistant managing editor. So I went from being the youngest executive to being the most veteran over my time there. And eventually, I was the one who got to announce things like the Pulitzer Prizes, as you can see here.
Michael,
So
we don't hear the sound.
Oh, no sound. Well, so that was just me announcing that we had won the Pulitzer Prize, another one, and it's an honor to be the most senior person in the newsroom and get to do that. So I also do things like appear on television, appear on the radio, talk about journalistic decisions that we had made. I was the newsroom spokesperson for just those types of things. And then I also was either fortunate or unfortunate for about 20 years to have been the main planning editor for election coverage. I can tell you that I am so looking forward to this year, that not being my responsibility for the first time in a long time in my life. I will just observe election night like a normal citizen. So that's a lot of my journalistic background, just to set the table of why am I even qualified to talk about journalism and media consumption. But I also am a serious reader of the Bible. I'm certainly not the level of expert that we have in the church, but I read it and reread it. And I've read it seeking knowledge and understanding and faith, and also as a literary piece. And I come back to certain verses and certain things that have helped guide me in my media career. And this verse from Proverbs chapter 18, verse 15, I've come back to a lot of my life. An intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. And so I always feel like there's more to know and more to learn about our world, and that the news is sort of the first way that we learn many things. I'm first going to talk about sources and perspective. So where are we getting the news, and whose perspective are we hearing it from? And my favorite lens on that is the Gospels. So there are four really, most important stories of the life of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if I was going to give each of them their own headline for the story they tell, I believe Matthew tells the story of the Messiah. Mark tells the story of the suffering Son of God. Luke tells the story of the Savior of all people. And John tells the story of the Son who reveals God. Now, the interesting thing is they're all telling the story of the same person, but they're telling it from their own unique perspective. And so everything that they've included, anything that they've excluded, all was filtered through their point of view. One of the examples I like to discuss about this is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all mention the time leading up to Passover when the disciples were making preparations for the feast. They say it in slightly different ways, but what you can take from it is that on the day of unleavened bread, there was a Passover lamb that had to be sacrificed, and they were all thinking of how to integrate Jesus into the meal. John doesn't mention this at all. He doesn't mention the preparations. And so, I've had debates with people before where we say, well, does that exclusion mean John didn't think it was important, or does it mean it's contradictory? And for me, what it means is that reporting what we have seen can be different without being contradictory, that each person having seen a series of events or known a story, will surface different pieces of it and give different weights to it. That we as human beings are imperfect and we filter events through our own experience and beliefs. So no matter how neutral we try to be, we come to things with everything we've known and everything about who we are. And that affects how we perceive the events and what we decide to include or exclude. Now, Matthew, I would say, also is the most organized. I find Matthew to be the most linear and the easiest to follow. Mark is the most dramatic. I feel like there's more flair in the writing of his story. Luke is the most succinct. I think he uses the most economy of words to say the things that he means. And John, I find the most ecclesiastical. It is the most about the church and the faith. So again, each of them has come with a completely different sort of point of view and a different way of looking at what is the same story. And I think through those four, we come to a place where we know and understand the life of Jesus better. It is through the four Gospels that we add to our knowledge and understanding of Jesus. And no one is more important than the other in adding to that understanding. And so when we read all four, we just have a more complete view because we are seeing that journey through the eyes of more people. And I think there's something similar to be said about how we consume the news. That each source you read on a news story can similarly add to your understanding of the world. So one of the things that I do is when something big or important happens, I will read a story and go find another story. Because each reporter who wrote about something, each editor who edited something is making a decision about what to keep in and what to leave out. And so just as John didn't have the preparations for the Passover, so might the first version of a story you read. And maybe that detail is the most important, or maybe it isn't. But if you read more than one source for a story, you will find out more. You will have a more well-rounded view of those events. It's just important to get information and news from more than one source. I think when we narrow our points of view, we limit our understanding. And one of the things that's amazing about the biblical account of Jesus is how broad the perspectives are, how many people are speaking, how many points of view are provided, because they each add to our understanding. Now, conforming to our bias. So Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." So one of the things I think that happens when we seek news sources is we tend to go for the ones that conform to us. And so rather than being shaped by the news, we choose news that conforms to the shape we already have. And that doesn't add necessarily to our understanding of the world, and it doesn't contribute to the empathy that we should have for all people. So I find that there's a danger in that, that it's a trap, and that we tend to go to the things that confirm our own biases and help shape us in a way that maybe isn't the right shape for us. Rather than being shaped by the news, we make ourselves the shape we desire, and then we seek to confirm it. So if we have an idea in our head, particularly in the modern world where there's so many news sources available, we tend to seek out the ones that confirm what we already believed, rather than the ones that might challenge what we believe. I'm going to show you, this is a recent one. I thought it'd be good to have a recent example. I'll show you a series of headlines, all taken at the same time, about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. And they range from neutral to truly propaganda. So this one's a fairly neutral one that's focusing very much on just the news, her death. This one strikes some balance where it's balancing her death with the political fight that will come around her replacement. This one sort of puts the fight front and center with her death as a secondary. This one has a very external perspective because it's a British publication. You know, death of liberal justice gives Trump chance to reshape U.S. for generations. So it's combined both the news and the future possibility. Same for this one. This one a little more lyrical. As the nation mourns, Trump pushes to fill Ginsburg vacancy without delay, uses the president's words. This one very much focused on the president and the action to replace. And then this one that's really meant to frighten you because it's from a conservative site where it's saying if you elect Biden president, Michelle Obama is going to be on the Supreme Court, which no person actually believes to be true. But it's intended to frighten you. So each of you probably seeing and hearing those headlines, one of those was more preferential to you, I would imagine. One of those spoke more to you. One of those approaches felt more comfortable to you. And we tend to go for whichever one is the one that feels more comfortable to us. This is a crazy chart. It can be a little hard to read, but there's a research group that ranks media on their bias and perspective. I don't always agree 100% with where they place everyone, but it does give you a good sense of sort of what it is that you're consuming. And so if you see this chart, it goes bottom to top. The closer to the top, the more fact-based the reporting is. The closer to the bottom, it's really more opinion. It's someone's ideas, but it's not verified fact. And then, of course, left to right is where the publications are on the political spectrum. So as you fall towards the corners, you're really getting less information and more opinion. One of the struggles today is the media world as we know it, we don't distinguish those things well. I think opinion is really dressed up as fact a lot of times now. And so it's important to know even just what you're consuming, sort of where their point of view is. And it may be one that agrees with you and that you feel like that's what I want to see and know. But it's also important to know how fact-based is it. One of the things I always enjoy is how highly placed the Weather Channel is. I don't know if you can see the Weather Channel at the very high center. The Weather Channel is very reliable and trusted for fact-based information. They report the weather. But other sources drop lower than you might imagine. There are two I like to highlight because these are the two that people in my life argue about a lot, is MSNBC and Fox News. And I think what you'll find in this chart is they are opposite versions of the same thing. So if you have a disdain for MSNBC and trust Fox News, or you have a disdain for Fox News and trust MSNBC, both of those are giving you less reliable information, more opinion information, less fact-based information. The ones that are sort of in this core box are ones that I go to more often. I read ones that fall all over this perspective. I tend to like written information better. So, I read The Economist, I read The Hill, I read The Guardian, I read The New York Times, The Washington Post, The LA Times, Bloomberg. I try to make sure that I have a broad diet. I think of it in the same way I think of planning my meals, that the more variety I have, the more nutritious that my consumption will be. But we tend to seek and believe the news that conforms to our beliefs and bias, and we set aside the news that disagrees. So when you look at that perspective, often if we plot ourselves on there, we find that we believe the media outlets that align with our views, and we disparage the ones that don't. And I think there's a danger in that. There's a danger in not understanding the full view of things and seeking information that confirms what we already believe instead of challenges our view. We must, I says much, but we must challenge ourselves to know more, to hear with an open heart news that might not conform to our views. We have to be willing to accept that what we thought before we heard something doesn't make what we hear true or right, and that we sometimes are challenged by things that we hear. And we have to read sources that challenge our views. I think it's really important to think about where you're getting information and to challenge where you're getting information from in a way that adds to your understanding and your compassion. This is a favorite series of verses of mine. From that time, of course now the screen is blocking part of me being able to see it, began to say to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed and be raised on the third day. And then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, you are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men. That's Matthew chapter 16, verse 21 to 23. It's a verse I think about a lot because it's a reminder that our hopes, our desires, our outcomes can mislead us. And that can happen too in how we get information and how we use information, that we can use information to justify our belief about people or about action, and that it doesn't necessarily lead us to the path that God asks of us. That we can let our desires and our hopes confuse what is really walking the path of God. So it's important to check our hopes and desires and how the news fuels them against the life that God expects of us. I know this is something that happens to me where I will allow the news to justify a thought I have that is not a good thought about someone else. Where it's someone that I view as either a political opponent or a different point of view, and I will hear news and my first thought will be, see, that shows me I'm right, they're wrong. But I don't then always think that is actually lifting up my spirit and helping me to walk the path that God has asked of us. And so I try to take a step back and remember that we are all loved the same, that there are not winners and losers in God's eyes. There are just his children. And that I can't let the news allow me to conform to a belief that then makes me oppositional to people that God also loves. A verse for all occasions. So this was a favorite saying of my theology professor in college. And because people would ask him, what's a good verse for a birthday or a wedding or for this time or for that time? And he'd say, oh, there's a verse for all occasions, but the Bible is meant to be consumed as a whole, and that you can pick and choose verses, of course, and they give us comfort. The Bible can provide guidance, comfort, knowledge, and understanding one verse at a time. Absolutely, it can. But it also can be a thing we pick and choose the verses that we like because they most conform to the life we're living or the beliefs that we have. And we will tend to ignore ones that challenge us or that call into question our approach. And the news can be very similar. The Bible is meant to be taken as a whole, is what my professor would say, and that our knowledge and understanding increase with the depth of study, that the more we know, the more times we revisit, that we come to different places of understanding through the whole of the book. And so the news can be very similar, that we tend to consume headlines, we tend to consume the news in small doses, but our understanding comes from a depth of reading. And it requires more effort, it requires more work, but increasing our understanding of our world and our fellow man is the result. And so if we narrow our news consumption to the small pieces, then our understanding is actually very small. We understand what a headline writer thought, or we understand what one person thought in a very small number of characters. But the more that we read or participate in the news, the deeper that our understanding becomes. Which brings me to passive versus active news consumption. The minister, the reverend that I grew up with, a man named Dr. Robert Agnew, a Presbyterian minister, unbelievable speaker. He made it worth coming to church every Sunday for all of us who were there. And even when I was a child, I was in awe of his ability to communicate. But one of the things he would say is that sitting in the pews with him was a passive way of learning about the Bible. That he was the one guiding, speaking, sharing, and through his knowledge, we gained understanding. But his view was it was also important for us to read the Bible ourselves. And he encouraged it and would ask you what verse or chapter you had recently been reading, put you on the spot occasionally. And his point of view about passive versus active news consumption has really, really stuck with me because I think it applies a lot of ways to the news, that we are prone to passive consumption of news, that we, particularly television is the easiest means of news consumption. We just turn the TV on and then someone who's decided what's most important and second most important says to us what the news is. It's an easy way to get the news because it's passive, but it also means we are not selecting what we're hearing. We are hearing what's been chosen. Active news consumption is, I think, reading and seeking out news. It is deciding for yourself what news you will go deeper into, what news you will look into, more. And I think each of them has an important place, but I also think that active leads to a deeper understanding. James has a couple of verses that I like about this, but he says, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. That is a constant reminder to me that my faith is in all the things that I do, including how I read the news and how I use the news. And does news that I hear call me to action? Do I hear something and think, I have to do something about that? If I hear the food bank is low on food, do I make note of it, or do I go and deliver a bag of food somewhere? And so I think through our faith, we have to be active participants because it leads us to active faith. And this one also from James, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. That listening, hearing, reading the Bible isn't enough. It's not what's being asked of us. It's that it has to turn into action. We have to do what is asked of us, and that is hard. It's not an easy thing to do, and it's not a thing that I certainly get right all the time. But I also see that parallel in our news consumption, that we can be such passive participants in what is happening in our world and knowing about our world, that we deceive ourselves into thinking that we are either right or that we don't have an obligation to take action to change what we are hearing. And then the last section I wanted to talk about today is sort of the good and the bad. There's a lot of bad news. I particularly feel like 2020 is trying to set some sort of record upon us of the number of difficult or bad things that we can hear at one time. But I've always loved this Psalm 112:7. He is not afraid of bad news. His heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. That our faith and devotion to Jesus and God can lead us to a place where we can hear the bad of the world in a way that we know it and understand it and have compassion for our fellow man and can think on if we can affect change. That just knowing bad news doesn't make our world any better, but knowing about it, knowing about human suffering, knowing about inequality, is what can lead us to try to change the world into the world that God wants for all of us. A world of fairness, equity, and where bad news is less frequent. But it's through his strength that we're able to hear these things and know these things. And I think it's important to be aware of some of the negative things that are happening in the world. We can feel very protected. We can feel very bubble-like. I know during this pandemic, my family, we've been largely at home. And so we're affected by it in that we don't have to go anywhere. But we're able to stay safe much more easily than many families are able to. But so hearing what is happening to other people helps me both in my understanding of suffering of my fellow human, and also can help me understand the action that I might need to take on. We have to separate our outrage from what is actually news too. So I think bad news has sort of become whatever anyone thinks is not right. And I think there's a difference between our outrage about news and what is actually bad, if that makes sense. So to me, human suffering is bad. That the virus taking the lives of many people is bad news. But there is an outrage that comes around that is not actually news. And I think we have to be careful not to stack outrage in our heart and allow ourselves to become the outrage. And that is the danger of sort of bad news. And I think that's where our strength and our faith is really important. It's that ability to hear negative things, bad things, pass them through a heart that loves God, and see what action can you take to make a difference. And then the other side of that coin is this verse from Proverbs, like cold water to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. We can't let the world be bad because there is so much bad news. And I assure you, it's not the only news there is. There are so many good and uplifting stories that happen every day. They're not as easy to find. They're not often front page news, but they do exist and they are there. And there are stories of people who overcome adversity or do the right thing or help one another. And those stories fill and warm our hearts and are important to our news consumption. we're not meant to only hear bad news. We're not meant to only know negative things. We're meant to know the good and the great of our fellow people and the ways in which people are making a difference. And so I spend time actively seeking out what are good stories, true stories, authentic stories of people who are making a difference for themselves or for others. We have to actively seek uplifting, true stories. I think true is an important part of this. There are lots of stories you'll hear that there's no way to know if it's true or if it's verifiable, and it sounds so great. And I always think, I don't know if that's true. It's just a little too perfect. But there are places that you can go and find real people, real stories, and it takes work. It isn't as easy. Those type of stories aren't the ones that always come forward, but they are the ones that you can see your own humanity and see your own potential and see that you too might be able to make a difference the way that some other very normal person did. And so then before we have questions and answers, I want to end with this perspective about what I think journalists' responsibility is in this world. So the most important thing a journalist does is act as the eyes and ears of the people, to be places others can't be, discover things no one else knows, and report back what is observed and learned. And the very most important thing is, above all else, a journalist must be human first, and then accurate and fair. Many people in the world give themselves the label of journalists these days. I don't know that they all uphold this standard that I've laid out. And with the understanding that we all bring our biases and everything we've known up to the moment we observe something. And so that reporting is an imperfect science. Being the observer for others is an imperfect science, but there are people who do the very best they can. And I think of the Gospels, I think of their reporting of the story of Jesus, how important it's been to the lives of billions of people. And did they get it perfect and right every time? No, because of human fallibility, they didn't. But it still was important that they did it, and that they were humans, and that they tried to be accurate and fair. So I'll talk a little bit, there's part 2 of this conversation next week. I hope you will all come back. I'm going to talk a little bit about misinformation, the dangers of misinformation, and what are we called to do as Christians to help push back against it. But I thought I would share the words of Moses for you to help get you ready for it, that you can't believe everything you read on the internet. It's one of Moses' most famous quotes. But so, because anyone can put anything onto a face or onto a person and claim that it was said or that it was done. And I think misinformation is a path astray. It's one of the things I think is the greatest dangers, both to our society and to our faith, that we can be misled by things that are simply not true. So that's next week's topic. And that brings us to question and answer time. That's me at Michael Whitley. I don't do a lot of social media, but I am on Twitter. I don't really love Facebook, so you will not find me on Facebook. But any of you who happen to use Twitter, I occasionally can be found there. All right, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, both about my presentation, if you have questions about the media or how the media works, or anything else you would like to ask, I'm happy to discuss.
I have switched to gallery view, and I will call on people as I see them, and I see Eric Wendorf's hand enthusiastically up in the air. So Eric, go ahead.
Michael, what conservative news source do you go to or would you recommend?
You know, my favorite one is the Wall Street Journal, and it's because I think they have reporters who are really serious about getting things right. And they have a very different point of view. I also think the Financial Times does a pretty nice job. And honestly, I read Fox News. Shep Smith, who unfortunately left Fox News, I actually thought Shep Smith was one of the most fair journalists you could imagine, which was funny that he was at Fox News and people have this weird opinion about Fox News. But those are the two that I read the most, the FT and the Wall Street Journal. And then there's also, I think, an important distinction there, news reporting and their opinion pages. I think the media does a terrible job of explaining that difference. I mean, the Wall Street Journal opinion pages is like the crazy wild west of conservatism. But I also find it really interesting. I find ideas there that challenge my point of view. You can imagine, as a longtime Californian, I am definitely more a liberal thinker, but I try to challenge some of my points of view about things. And, you know, one of those ways for me in particular about American rights and American law is sort of taking the Constitution as a whole. As I was saying earlier about Bible verses, we tend to, you know, we can pick and choose Bible verses, we can pick and choose headlines. I think we've come to a point where we pick and choose our rights a little bit too. So there are a lot of people who support the Second Amendment, but not the first, or the first and not the second. And so those are places where I try to challenge myself, where I am a huge First Amendment supporter, and I try to understand better support for the Second Amendment.
So I have a question about media consumption. You recommend a depth and breadth of media to consume. What do you say to a person who hypothetically works a full-time job and has a toddler? How would you recommend a depth and breadth of media consumption in a way that also allows them to feed a child?
Yes. So I think that this is a challenge for sure. Depth and breadth, particularly at this time when work and life and childcare have all become one thing, so difficult. But one of the things I think is important is to first really take an inventory of the time that you are spending consuming information. And I think if you note it, you'll notice that many people during the day, we're on our phones, we're on our screens, and we're sort of taking little bites at it more than we realize. I think that actually is a thing in my life I've worked on pausing, like not just sort of bouncing back to headlines all day long. That for me, it's a professional habit, but it's one that I'm not always sure serves me in the best way. That I try to instead find time, even if it's 15 minutes, that I'm going to go to the trusted sources that I prefer and really look and see what are the things that I'm going to read. And sometimes I know I have to set them aside for later. You know, so I'll say, okay, I'm gonna mark that and come back to it. I think it's sort of like nutrition, Jeff. It's like making sure that the quality is there when you can, and that you're cutting down on your snacking, because the snacking part sometimes feels like the least healthy. And it's also knowing that your life, you have a limited amount of time. And so just making sure that the time you do spend, however much is available, that you're making sure that the information you're getting is quality. So maybe you go for, you can't quite spend the depth that you want to, but you make sure that you're using that time on quality sources. So you're reading a preferred journalistic outlet as opposed to getting your news from Facebook.
Follow up on that. Well, I guess maybe not a follow up, but I'm just jeopardizing the Q&A time. But opinion versus fact-based reporting. If you're on a limited schedule, what do you think the optimal ratio for reading the opinion pages versus reading the news pages?
I think the news pages should probably be the bulk of it. I feel like the opinion pages to me are a little, they're a little bit high calorie. That news and facts and understanding are more simple and add in a different way to our understanding. That opinion, some of it depends on how you're using opinion journalism. I find that I seek out opinion journalism that makes me outraged, and then I'm not happy, and it didn't actually make me feel better, and it didn't add to my understanding. And it's one of the things I have to be really careful about, is like not allowing myself to go to the things that I know will make me mad. You know, I think when we read more facts, it adds to our understanding. When we read opinion journalism, it's really critical that you're reading from people that you think might challenge a belief you have or challenge a point of view you have, but in a way that's going to be good. So for me, just an example, you know, Tom Cotton wrote a piece in the New York Times calling on the National Guard to come out against protesters. That didn't make me feel any better. It actually just made me really mad. I didn't think it was appropriate for a member of the government to say we're going to use the National Guard against the citizens who have the right to assemble. And And even if there are looters, the looters and the protesters are separate. That's just my point of view. But I found that I read that anyway, and what I did was just really wind myself up. So that wasn't well-used time for me. I knew what it was going to say, and I read it anyway. Now, sometimes it's good to know just that oppositional view. I mean, one of the things I was talking with my wife about today was, Satan gets to speak in the Bible. And so that tells you that it's important to know what you're up against sometimes, to truly understand the opposing point of view in a way. And so I do think there is something good about reading those other point of views. It's just, it has to be in a way that adds to the expansion of your knowledge and your thinking. And if it reaches the point that you're reading opinion journalism to make yourself mad, or just to confirm your already held beliefs, that seems less productive to me than trying to read well-reported news about the world.
I'll open up to more questions, but I want the record to reflect that Michael did compare Tom Cotton to Satan. If anybody is, no,
there goes my political career.
Yeah, right. You're sunk, Michael. Sorry. Anybody else who has any questions? Yeah, Barb Eichenberry. You can unmute yourself.
Sorry. Technology challenged all of a sudden. So how does one approach somebody who seems threatened by ideas that are not their own, not aligning with their own stuff? I mean, they're like, no. How do you talk? How do you even start a conversation with them?
So that's a real challenge. It's one of the things I'm going to talk some about next week too, is pushing back against misinformation. But to answer your question, I think human connection is the most important part of this. Like that I find conversations held through social media, on Facebook posts, those types of places are so unproductive, and we wind each other up, and we start to lose our humanity in how we even treat each other. I mean, I've watched members of my own family come unraveled on Facebook posts where it's like, you are cousins to each other. What is even happening right now? Where they're talking to each other in a way they would never talk to each other in person, just never. So I think some of it is trying to find commonality, common ground, and also coming at it from the perspective that I am not the person who's right explaining to the person who's wrong. That tone sets people off. It sets me off if it's the other way around, because it's the tone people approach me with sometimes too. And so I think it has to be done in the spirit of discussion and learning, that you genuinely want to hear what their point of view is and explain yours, and share what you think and then what they think. I think that's the way that it can go better. And I think when we come at it from, let me tell you all the ways that your opinion is wrong, then people just stop. They don't hear you anymore. And it's actually one of the things I think is a real struggle in society right now, is that we have become divided into the who's right and who's wrong. And we all believe that we're right. And there's very little compromise and very little middle. And it's the middle where truth is often found. I mean, I think of news stories that are happening now where some people see the protesters, some people see the looters. But the truth is there are protesters and looters, and that those are two different groups of people, and that we have to be able to see the both, that the protesters have the right to peaceably assemble, and that many of them, I mean, there were 60,000 protesters in Austin, Texas one day, and who peacefully assembled and nothing bad happened. And then 200 people at night broke glass, lit things on fire, and that those can be separate things. And we have to come to a place where we can have that conversation, and where you can acknowledge that the people doing the torching of buildings, that's not all right. We have to have safety, but that the people who peacefully assembled did so in mass, and it was their right to do so, and that we need to protect and observe rights. So when we can find common ground like that, I think it helps the discussion a lot. And I think the ability to acknowledge not everything someone different than you thinks is wrong, and not everything that we think as their opposing view are right.
Thank you. Very insightful. I appreciate that.
Charlie, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Hi, Michael. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. I'm curious, out of all the sources that you have for your digestion of news, how much of that is hard copy and how much of that is online? because I'm kind of old school. I delivered the Hartford Courant newspaper for 7 years, and I've always been a newspaper guy. But over the last 10 years, pretty much stopped subscribing to hard copy stuff just because I was getting it from other sources. But at the same time, I've recognized that it's very easy for me to get on my phone or my laptop and scroll through a bunch of stuff, read some headlines, read a sentence or two of many articles. We still get a hard copy of the Sunday New York Times, in part because I like doing the puzzles and I just like the ritual of it. But I also find that when I have a hard copy in front of me, I tend to read an entire article much more so than I do on my phone or on my screen. And I'm wondering, my sense is that that's a pretty common thing, that a lot of us are, skimming the headlines and feeling informed rather than taking a deep dive. And just curious what your experience is personally with that, and if there are any broader trends that you're seeing. I'm not a technology basher. I'm not I think technology is great, but I feel like we've got to train ourselves to use it well. That seems to be what you're getting onto.
Yeah. So I do some of each, of course. I have digital subscriptions to a lot of publications, and the upside I see of digital is the accessibility, that it's pretty easy to have access to a lot of sources digitally and be able to bounce between them just at one desk. But I also think, digital is snacking. I always use food metaphors. You can tell I'm hungry, but digital is really snacking, and we tend to bounce through things, and our attention span for digital is not one of completion, just as you described, Charlie. It's we tend to take a little bit and then we'll stop and back out and start looking for something else. I think reading a print edition is it's like eating at a Las Vegas buffet. There is a sense of discovery about it, and there are things you didn't know you wanted to know until you come across them, and you come across them in a very different way in a printed publication. It's hard to read deep into the offerings on a website. We just tend not to do it. We tend to come to an article and bounce back out of it, where that printed reading experience is one where you turn each page and you're making a decision about, do I want to consume that or not consume that? But we do tend to read in a more complete way. And I think there is actually a biblical parallel to that, in that I will go online and look for a Bible verse I'm looking for, and I'll find that verse and I'll read that verse, and then that thus ends my reading of the Bible for that day. Where when I have the book in front of me, I tend to bounce around. I tend to be reminded of things by other things, and I'll read a whole chapter of something to make sure that I am thinking about the context of the verse I was looking for with everything that happened before and after. So I think there's a balancing act to it for sure. That the way you can push back against it too, though, is for digital, I sometimes set aside reading time. I don't get the physical Washington Post anymore. I don't even know if you can here. But so I set aside time for myself where I say, I'm going to, on this morning, take advantage of my Washington Post subscription. And I very intentionally am there to read more completely. And I tend to do that in front of a desktop instead of my phone. My phone almost always is a place that I won't finish an article.
I feel like I'm feeling compelled to go home and at some point today just pick up the New York Times and say, I'm going to read 3 articles in their entirety, no matter what they are.
Yep.
Thank you.
See,
Yes,
Nick
Nick.
has a question.
Now to, I guess, continue the food analogy a little bit more, I feel like oftentimes we're trying to encourage ourselves to read the Bible more. We need a little bit more of a healthy diet with that. But I think almost the news is a bit like us being a continual all-inclusive. And I know that at all-inclusives, I have a tendency to gain way too much weight. So would appropriate fasting from the news be something we should consider, as opposed to necessarily more news? I personally think sometimes sticking my head in the sand and saying, let me just stay away from this unhealthy quantity of information.
So what I tend to do, Nick, is I make sure that I'm not over consuming. I make sure that I'm doing what's healthy for me, and I stop when my understanding stops, right? So breadth and depth has a limit to it. So if I read one story about something that happened, I might understand it in one way. And if I read 3, I might understand it a little more, but there becomes a diminishing return point. If I read 18, have I really added that much more to it? So just again, to use a biblical example, it'd be like if there were If there were 20 gospels, would that have added more understanding than the 4 that we have? I don't know that it would have necessarily. So, so I think having some limits and having some limitation, but I also think giving yourself self-care and grace is really important, and knowing when it's too much for you. Like I have days where I just go, I just need a break from looking at the COVID numbers today. I need to not look at it. I know it's not good, and I just will accept that it's not good, but knowing it won't increase my ability to act about it on this particular day. So I'm just going to pause that for a minute. So I try to know what my limitations are and what will make me upset. So what adds to my understanding is up to a point, and then what makes me upset goes beyond that. And sort of knowing yourself and knowing what you can handle, and is information fueling you in a way that helps you and makes you better, helps you walk the path of a Christian life? Or is it, as I said earlier, is it fueling your outrage? And when you're fueling your outrage is a really good time to just stop and go do something else, and to try to take a deep breath and remind yourself, like, the purpose of knowing things is not to make myself angry and angry. It's to add to my understanding of my fellow human beings and think on how can I use that information to improve my life, my Christian life, and the world around me.
So we have come to the end of our time. Michael will be back next week. So if you had a question that you needed answered, write it on a Post-it note and put it somewhere you'll see it next Sunday. Thank you, Michael, for the presentation. Informative, wonderful, very much appreciated. I will try and listen to what you said, but being angry feels so good sometimes. It does. But I appreciate the wisdom. I will now, you know what, I'm going to open it up and I'm going to give a 5-second window for a response. Would anybody here like to close us with a prayer?
I'll do it. Can I be the prayer leader? Is that okay?
By all means.
Heavenly Father, please grant us your wisdom as we are bombarded with information in this world. Let us see what helps us, adds to our understanding of the life that you expect of us. Help us to set aside the things that do not. Help us to make this world closer to the kingdom on earth that you imagine. In Jesus and God's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks again, Michael. I'm going to stop.